Hello, and welcome to session 6 of the massive open online course in digital currencies for the University of Nicosia. I'm Andreas Antonopoulos, and I'll be answering the questions you had from the last week, as well as live questions from the forums, from the chat room, from the Google Plus chat room, and from the YouTube chat room. If you have follow-up questions during this session, please don't hesitate to ask them. Today's session is live from Athens, Greece, where I am currently visiting. So it's a special occasion. Let's dive right in. Don asks, could the same technique used by colored coins be used with reasonable accuracy to trace the use of a stash of Bitcoin? Does the standard say anything about using the first or second addresses as a change address when building a client? These are really good questions, Don. So I'll address both of them. First of all, what you're referring to here is the idea that a colored coin can create a chain of ownership, where as transactions move that coin around, it can be tracked through a chain of ownership. Back to the point where it originated and associated with a colored coin. So in that sense, you can do this with any form of Bitcoin. However, when colored coins are being moved around by wallets, the wallets are very careful to structure the transaction in such a way as to not mix colored coins or move colored coins to addresses that don't recognize colored coins. So a wallet that doesn't know that colored coins exist under an address might spend them to pay a fee, for example, or something like that, in a way that that causes problems with tracking the colored coins. As long as you're always moving them with a colored coin-aware wallet, it will construct transactions that cleanly move the colored coins in the way predicted by the protocol. And that's a requirement. Now, you can track Bitcoin transactions in such a way that you can create chains of transactions that associate ownership. However, Bitcoin transactions don't have to be from a single source to a single destination. And the source and destination addresses don't have to belong to the same owner, or they may belong to the same owner. And there is nothing distinguishing which address is a change address and which is not. Bitcoin transaction may have a very large number of inputs from different addresses that belong to the same owner or different owners, and go to a large number of destination addresses which may belong to the same owner or different owners. Effectively, you can, with one transaction, express the purchases and payments of many people simultaneously, as done by a protocol called CoinJoin, that allows people to join all of their transactions together into a single transaction. And once you do that, it becomes much harder to trace continuity of transactions through that, because they become jumbled up. This is also the case when coins are moved into or out of a hot wallet, a wallet that's used to express the balance jointly of many users of a system that has custodial control of Bitcoin. For example, if you have a wallet service where the users are not in control of the keys, but they have accounts with a company that controls all of the keys, it's very common for these companies to move all of the transactions for all of their users through a single address or through a set of predictable addresses and mix them all together for efficiency and convenience and flow purposes, rather than trying to assign a separate address to each customer. Just like in the traditional banking system, if you deposit money in cash at the bank, they won't put that in a special box just for you. And if you withdraw money a day later, they're not going to give you the same cash. They will take the money and they will put it into one big bucket where all of the money of all of the customers is moving, and you receive different cash than the one you put in when you withdraw money from the bank the next day. What that means is that, again, hot wallets act as a brake. They make it very difficult to trace Bitcoin consistently. If you have enough liquidity and movement in the Bitcoin system, and you have enough transactions touching multiple points and getting mixed, during merchant processing or exchanges or large wallets that have custodial accounts. In the end, what happens is that almost every Bitcoin touches almost every other Bitcoin, and they're all associated with each other, and it's very difficult to untangle essentially the web of ownership within Bitcoin. The second question is related to this. Does the standard say anything about using the first or second addresses as a change address when building a client? There is no standard. There's no requirement as to which address you have to use. However, which address is used as change address by a client, which output is used as a change address, to be more specific. There's two issues here. In a transaction, the first output could be the payment, and the second output or last output could be the change address. And in fact, many wallets do that. They use the first, second, third, or however many outputs they need in order to make payments, and then they use the last output to make change back. That's not necessary. You can make the change the first address, the last address, the third address, or whichever address you want. In fact, the positioning of the change output and the address you use to send change, perhaps if it is the same as the source address, provides a fingerprint that can tell you with a fair degree of accuracy what kind of wallet created this transaction. So transactions have enough unique characteristics in them that you can actually fingerprint and find which wallet software, which wallet software created this transaction based on a few design decisions made by the client in how to structure the transaction, because there are enough choices to leave a bit of a fingerprint of the client. It also means that if you see a wallet using a specific output as a change address, and you can identify that, and you know which address is a change address, it makes it a lot easier to track payments, because then you know which addresses belong to the same owner and which ones are payments. So distinguishing between a payment address and a change address, or a payment output and a change output, is how you can increase the trackability of Bitcoin payments and reduce the privacy of Bitcoin payments. So there is a standard, and this is not what you think. It's the exact opposite of what you think. There is a standard for ordering outputs in a way that does not reveal whether they are change or payment, and in fact makes it impossible to derive any information about whether they are change or payment by picking a different scheme. And the scheme is to sort the outputs in a transaction lexicographically or alphabetically. The idea being that rather than always doing the first transaction as the first transaction output as change, or the last transaction output as change, you create all of the outputs in the transaction, and then you shuffle them so that they are ordered alphabetically based on the output address. What this does, or to be more specific, based on the script pub key in the output. What this does is it reduces the opportunity for wallets to pick one or other strategy that will reveal either information about the wallet or information about the payment. This is BIP 69. It was written by Christoph Atlas, who is a security and privacy expert. And it is designed specifically to increase privacy by not revealing information about which is the change address. So BIP 69, very interesting BIP. Not many wallets do it. In fact, the majority of wallets today reuse addresses and have fixed patterns in which output they choose to put the change in, which reveals far too much information. There is an open Bitcoin privacy report which ranks wallets based on their choices and whether those choices enhance privacy. And one of the things that's looked at is the ordering of outputs, as well as the reuse of addresses. These are all criteria on which different wallets are ranked. It's a very interesting report to read, not just to learn about the different rankings of wallets, but to also understand why those criteria are important for privacy when building your own wallet. Don asks, how is proof of existence of a document significantly different than using op return and paying miners in a non-destructive way? Is it somehow conceptually, even morally wrong to use proof of burn to do proof of existence? So some proof of existence systems, especially in the past, used a mechanism that would destroy Bitcoin by sending a tiny amount of Bitcoin into essentially a fake address, a fake destination address that is non-redeemable or unspendable. There is nothing morally wrong with proof of burn or destroying Bitcoin, primarily because from an economic sense, every portion of Bitcoin that is destroyed is a gift to everybody else who holds Bitcoin, because it commensurately increases the value of all of the other Bitcoin. So it's not really a problem morally or conceptually. However, from a practical standpoint, if you create an unspendable address, but it is not obvious that it is an unspendable address, clients will keep that address in their UTXO set, the set of all unspent transaction outputs. But because this transaction output is unspendable, it will remain unspent forever, which means that you're imposing a burden that has to be carried on by future generations of clients, just in case someone spends it, not knowing that, in fact, no one can spend it because there is no corresponding private key. It's a fake address that was used solely to store data. That is a primary motivation for the design of OP return, OP return. OP return is a script code that allows you to embed data. And it was a compromise because people were able to embed data. And in fact, there's no real way to stop people from embedding data. But they were doing it in a way that had not only the impact on the use of disk space, but also by increasing the UTXO set, by creating these unspendable addresses that you wouldn't know are unspendable. Op return is provably unspendable, and op return, by definition, by design, cannot be spent. And therefore, while it will take up some space in the blockchain, 80 bytes is the limit for op return. It is not included by clients in the UTXO set because it's not something you can spend. And therefore, this allows you to store data in the blockchain in a way. It's a compromise that reduces the bloat of the UTXO set. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, all of the proof of existence document auditing and fingerprinting systems that exist today use op return. It's more convenient, it's more clean, and it reduces the impact on the system. All right. Janine has a great question. Bitcoin 12, version 0.12, allows transactions with multiple op returns to be considered standard, whereas before, only one output could be an op return output. So what this means is that up to version 12 of Bitcoin, a transaction could have an op return output, but only one. It can have other outputs in addition to the op return, but those could not also be op return outputs. As of version 0.12 of Bitcoin, however, you can now have multiple op returns as outputs in a transaction. So you can get a transaction that has multiple op returns. Now that many op returns can be put into a single transaction output, what developments do you think this will facilitate? So I'm not sure if it's in a single transaction output or if it's in multiple outputs. It doesn't really matter. That's not really a big difference since they're unspendable. What developments do you think this will facilitate? Some say it's spam, regarding the ongoing spam attack slowing down the network, spam attack within quotes. But I like it since it's important to a blockchain project I am currently working on. First of all, and I've said this before, I don't think that there is such a thing as a spam transaction. As far as I'm concerned, if a transaction is willing to pay the fee, to be mined into the blockchain. It is legitimate in the eyes of the sender who was willing to pay that fee. And that should be a market determination that establishes the balance between supply and demand, supply from the miners for capacity in the blockchain, and demand by applications for that capacity. And if people want to use it to put up returns or other transactions, not only is there no way to stop that kind of use of the blockchain, because they'll use other techniques to do it, but also, in my opinion, this enables applications to be built that are desirable. And perhaps over time, as those applications, if those applications become popular, we can find more efficient and more optimized ways of enabling these applications. But you don't get to experiment and learn what application patterns people want to use with Bitcoin unless you open the door for people to do things like that. In fact, since the door is already open, or rather the window is open, you can come in through the window in Bitcoin and embed data and transactions. Op return represents the front door, so everybody knows what's going on. It's clear that it's unspendable, and it creates the opportunity to experiment with applications. I am not really concerned about abuse of op return. We haven't seen the nightmare scenario of abuse of op return really occur. Op return, because of its 80-byte hash limit, can very easily be used to store the root of a Merkle tree. So in many cases, it's unnecessary to store more than a summary for a very large data set that is expressed as a Merkle tree. And you can just store the root in the blockchain, and you can keep the rest of the tree and metadata off-chain, which is far more efficient. And so for a number of reasons, it would make sense for designers of applications to use the Bitcoin blockchain with op return in order to anchor information for immutability into the blockchain, and have the rest as metadata. I'm not really concerned about this change. And in fact, the reason we have multiple op returns per transaction now is because the experiments with op return, first limited to only 40 bytes, then increased to 80, and now allowing multiple op returns, demonstrated that the use of op return has not exploded to unreasonable levels, has not created a massive problem on the network, and in fact is probably helping by reducing the UTXO set you'd have otherwise. OK, let's talk a bit more about coins and fees. Odin asks, I have heard that miners will prioritize old coins regardless of transaction fees. I assume that an old coin is a Bitcoin that has been stored in the same address for a particular amount of time? Question mark. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, let's assume that I receive one Bitcoin to my address and immediately send it to another address, but I accidentally forget to include a miner fee. Does my Bitcoin get older while in transit? And if we assume that all blocks are full, how long does the coin stay in limbo before it's old enough to get included in a block? All right, let's take this one by one. Some of these questions, they're great questions. Some of these questions refer to changes in the protocol that we need to be aware of. So first of all, I've heard that miners will prioritize old coins regardless of transaction fees. This is not entirely true. This was the case up to, I believe, version 11, 0.11 of Bitcoin. Every block had a 50 kilobyte space called the priority space reserved for priority transactions. And priority transactions were transactions that had at least one coin day of age, and that was spending one coin day of age. I'll explain that in just a second. And those transactions would get prioritized in order of decreasing fee, and as many as possible of those high priority transactions would go into the priority section of the block, after which they would again, be prioritized for the queue for the remaining transactions. This meant that under certain circumstances, old coins could go through without transaction fees. So what is coin age? Coin age is if you take a UTXO and you look at the date that UTXO was created or mined into the blockchain, and then you multiply the value of that UTXO, the age is the value times the number of blocks that have elapsed. So for example, 1 Bitcoin times 144 blocks is a 1 coin age, or an age of 144, which is considered high priority. So anything that was more than 1 Bitcoin times 1 day old, 1/100th of a Bitcoin would have to be 100 days old in order to reach the same age. 1,000th of a Bitcoin would have to be 1,000 days old. 10 Bitcoin would only have to be 1/10 of a day old to reach the same priority. And so that's how the prioritization system worked. However, this has now been discontinued, and Lesser Miner is either has a custom prioritization scheme, or they are using a parameter to change the default settings in Bitcoin in order to include high priority transaction, or they are running an older version of Bitcoin, which is unlikely at this point. Coin age is not prioritized over transaction fees. In fact, now the fee per kilobyte calculation is assumed. So Auden also says, I assume that an old coin is a Bitcoin that has been stored in the same address for a particular amount of time. It's, I think, important to get our terminology correctly. So I'm going to make a small change to that question and say, an old coin is a Bitcoin that has been stored in a UTXO, in an unspent transaction output. An unspent transaction output corresponds to an address in broad terms, but it is a more basic construct than that. It has a script pub key that allows it to be spent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's a regular Bitcoin address. It could be a pay-to-script hash script. It could be a multisig script. And not all of the script types we have will always necessarily have addresses associated with them, although it's likely that's not necessarily true. So we've got to think about not Bitcoin as being stored in addresses, but Bitcoin being stored in unspent transaction outputs. So that is the fundamental unit of Bitcoin. That's a really important distinction to understand. Unspent transaction outputs have a script which tells you what address or keys can be used to spend them, or what script can be used to spend them. But fundamentally, UTXO is the unit we're talking about here. And so from that context, yes, an old coin is any amount that has been stored in a UTXO, and its age is the value times the number of blocks it has been stored. Value in Satoshis times the number of blocks it has been stored. Now let's look at the second part of Auden's questions. Let's assume that I receive 1 Bitcoin to my address and that I immediately send it to another address, but I accidentally forget to include a miner fee. Does my Bitcoin get older while in transit? Again, I'm going to make some changes to the terminology here because I think it's important to understand these distinctions. So let me rephrase that question. Let's assume I receive 1 Bitcoin to my address. Let's rephrase that as, let's assume I have received a 1 Bitcoin UTXO, unspent transaction output, that I can spend. And I immediately spend it, not send it, spend it to another UTXO or address, and accidentally forget to include a miner fee in that transaction. So when you immediately spend it, you're creating a transaction to spend 1 UTXO and create another UTXO if you don't include a fee. Does my Bitcoin get older while in transit? And this is going to be the point where I'm going to object to the terminology even more and say, Bitcoin is never in transit. It's really important to understand this. Bitcoin is never in transit for the simple reason that Bitcoin is UTXO. It is either the UTXO that's being created as an output, and either a transaction spending that UTXO is confirmed or it's not. If the transaction has not been confirmed, the Bitcoin is still the UTXO that has not been spent. The unspent transaction output, it can be double spent. It's still sitting in the source. It does not leave there. And if the transaction is confirmed, then Bitcoin is the new UTXO that was created by that transaction. There's no limbo in between. The transaction is either confirmed or it's not confirmed. And that state change from the input UTXO to the output UTXO, which the transaction represents, is an atomic state change. It happens instantaneously and atomically, all of it at once. It's first in one place, in one UTXO, then it's in the other because the state changed, and there is no in between. Now, that's some clarification on the terminology, because it really helps to think about Bitcoin as UTXO and to think about transactions as causing a state change in the UTXO from one to another. So if you have a Bitcoin UTXO and you spend that with a transaction, and you do not include the transaction fee, now, theoretically, if the miners were doing prioritization on age, the longer that transaction stayed in the mempool, the higher its priority would get. Because with every block, the UTXO in the input of that transaction has a higher age, because you're counting that unspent transaction output, which is already in the blockchain. You're counting its age versus its value. And the follow-up question is, if we assume that all blocks are full, how long does a coin stay in limbo before it is old enough to be included in a block? Again, that is not the way transactions are prioritized anymore. We did see the scenario in the past that a transaction would have not enough fee, but then it would get old enough and then finally get included because it became high priority. That doesn't work anymore. Instead, what we see today on the network is two mechanisms for transactions that have low fee. The first mechanism is opt-in replace by fee, or RBF. Opt-in replace by fee requires you to first mark your transactions with a specific sequence number as transactions that are requesting replace by fee capability. And then once a transaction has been marked as such, a new transaction can be created later which changes the fee. And what that does is it allows you to send a transaction, mark it as opt-in RBF, and then if you see that during the time you were sending that transaction, the average network fee has gone up, or capacity, less capacity is available, and you want to change the transaction, effectively make it a higher priority, then you can do a new transaction that spends the same inputs with a higher fee using replace by fee. That's one method. Opt-in replace by fee essentially means that the sender double spends the inputs with a higher fee in order to prioritize their transaction. So the burden is on the sender, but in order to do that, they have to first opt in. The first transaction has to indicate that it is accepting RBF, or replace by fee, transaction replacement to come later. The second mechanism is called child pays for parent, or CPFP. Child pays for parent is a mechanism where the recipient of a transaction can make that transaction confirm faster by chaining it with a child transaction that has a higher fee. This is based on the economic incentives of miners who already do this. And what they do is, when they have a series of transactions in the mempool, some of those transactions will be chained, which means that you have an unconfirmed transaction that has a child transaction that spends the outputs it will create. perhaps even a grandchild and a great-grandchild. So you have a chain of transactions spending outputs, the inputs of one or the outputs of the other to the inputs of one or the outputs of the other, chained together. None of them confirmed, all of them in the mempool. Some of these chains can get very long. We see this scenario occur in a number of different scenarios, including withdrawals from exchanges, settlement of payments in places that do trading at a much faster rate than the Bitcoin blockchain can allow, et cetera, et cetera. And also simply in the spending of change, unconfirmed change, that creates chained transaction. If you receive change back from a previous transaction and then you want to make a new transaction, your new transaction may spend that change while it's still unconfirmed by chaining as a child to the unconfirmed transaction. Traditionally, miners would consider the fee per kilobyte of each transaction independently. However, that is not the optimal strategy. What if you have two transactions that are chained together? And the first transaction pays a millibit, and the child transaction pays 20 millibits. Well, you could collect the 20 millibits, but you can't collect the 20 millibits until you have the parent confirmed, which has a millibit fee. Rather than looking at the parent and rejecting it, which then effectively also rejects the child or delays the child's inclusion, if you add the size of the two transactions together and divide by the fee and see what fee per kilobyte they pay jointly together, the whole chain, could be a chain of thousands of transactions or hundreds of transactions, and you evaluate the fee per kilobyte across the entire chain, then if you accept that fee and it's high enough, and you include all of the transactions into the block as a miner, that's the optimal, profitable scheme. And so this emerged naturally, just through self-interest of the miners. They started implementing a child pays for parent policy, whereby if they had a chain, they would look at the children's fees to see if those were enough to make the parents get through, and then include both. What that gives you is the opportunity to use this in order to prioritize the transaction. Let's say you're a merchant. You just received the payment for a cup of coffee, and the fee from the client was insufficient. Well, you can create a child transaction that spends the cup of coffee you have received, which is not yet confirmed, perhaps back to one of your change addresses, and in the child transaction put a bigger fee, and that bumps up the fee for the chain and may allow the initial payment from your customer to be confirmed. So two strategies. Opt-in replaced by fee has to be arranged in advance. The first transaction has to have the opt-in replaced by fee flag in the sequence number. And then the sender can increase the fee by creating a replacement transaction that double spends it. Child pays for parent, in which the recipient of a transaction can tag on a chain transaction of their own with a higher fee in order to pull through the first transaction that they are expecting to receive, which is also a very good strategy. This opens the door for example, merchants offering no-fee transactions, because they can pay a fee for you by simply putting a child on every transaction that's incoming with a much bigger fee that covers both. Or it enables accelerating confirmations and prioritizing transactions. All kinds of strategies there. Replaced by fee and child pays for parent are the effectively new way of handling fee prioritization on the blockchain, so that a marketplace for fees and sophisticated behavior by wallets and merchants that anticipate the necessary fee to prioritize a transaction by looking at prior behavior of the network, but can also adjust the fee of a transaction while it is waiting to be confirmed in the mempool, either by adding a child or replacing the original transaction, and thus reprioritizing it in flight. These techniques are now designed to be a more efficient way of having a fee calculation than the mechanism of prioritizing by age. of the coin. Okay, that was a lot of questions. Let's see if we have any more in the forums, any live questions from the forums right now. Not seeing any at the moment, so let's cover a couple more from our notes. Don asks, now that the stress test of the last few weeks is over, I wonder if a future stress test could have an impact on sidechains and smart transactions, in the sense that the transaction fee would have to be decided in advance, conceivably far in advance for time lock transactions. If they get the TX fee too low, do those smart transactions ever get confirmed? So in the past, time lock was a transaction level feature. And that meant that you had to construct the transaction and hold it privately well in advance. And you couldn't actually post it on the blockchain or essentially inject it into the network or propagate it into the network or have it recorded on the blockchain until the time lock had expired. This causes two problems. One, you have to store these transactions somehow. And two, as Dom says here, you have to decide the transaction fee well in advance. This is one of the things that check lock time verify solves. Op CLTV or op check lock time verify or CLTV or check lock time verify, just check lock time verify, is a feature that was introduced with I believe BIP 68, if I'm not mistaken, or BIP 65, sorry, with BIP 65, which is a script feature that allows you to put a time lock on a UTXO, not in the transaction as a whole, but to specifically put it inside the UTXO, inside the script, the SIG-pub key. Now, what this allows you to do is two things. One, the lock time can be per output. So you could have a transaction where one of the outputs has a time lock and the other one doesn't. In fact, that's a very common construct we see in payment channels in the Lightning Network, where essentially there are two options of how the transaction outputs are created, one with a time lock, one without. The other thing you can do is once you put the time lock in the UTXO, that means you can immediately broadcast the transaction. The transaction is valid. The transaction gets mined and confirmed with whatever fee it has, and the UTXO is recorded. But now you can't spend the UTXO in a new transaction until that time lock has expired. So you don't actually try to spend it, and you don't create a transaction to spend it, and you don't decide on the fee for that transaction until the time lock has expired, at which point you're doing it in real time. So when the time lock expires, you construct a transaction, you estimate the fee you need to pay based on the current conditions of the network, and you pay it. You're not constructing the transaction far in advance. The lock is in the UTXO embedded in the blockchain. It's not in the transaction that spends it. So that way, check lock time verify solves the problem that you identified quite correctly, Don, which is that with the old nlock time feature, you had a problem because you couldn't predict what the fee would be in the future. And to use nlock time transactions with very long delays is a problem. The other big problem with the old mechanism was that while you could agree and create an nlock time transaction that could only be spent in the future, you could still double spend the original UTXO. The UTXO that were inputs to that lock time transaction were spendable with no restrictions, perhaps. And if they had no other restrictions, you could spend them right away. So even if there is an nlock time transaction sitting around, that doesn't preclude you from creating another transaction that double spends the same inputs. Check lock time verify makes that a lot simpler, because now the lock time is on the UTXO, so you can't double spend that with another transaction. The lock time is recorded in the blockchain. With then lock time on the transaction level rather than check lock time verify, the only way to protect yourself against double spending through an unlocked anytime transaction was to have the original UTXO locked by a multisig, so that it required the consent of both parties or more than two parties involved in this transaction. And again, this has great importance specifically for applications that use these features, multisig and lock time, in order to construct complex structures such as payment channels and the Lightning Network. Don asks, I have set my mempool expiry to 240 in my Bitcoin file, and now I see hundreds of old, huge 15K spam transactions and a few smaller default fee transactions that never got mined in the default 3 days, and I assume now only exist in my local mempool that were used in the network, and that these were used in the network attack stress test. If anything, this stress test taught us that an attack lasting more than 3 days will result in legitimate transactions not getting mined and expiring. So again, I've said this before, but here's the thing. You're making an assumption that the 15K transactions are spam and the smaller default fee transactions are legitimate, but that judgment is really a matter of perspective. And here's the question. If the 15K spam transactions or other transactions pushed out the smaller default fee transactions, that means the smaller default fee transactions did not have sufficient fee. And really, that's a problem in wallet design, among other things, meaning that if wallets make intelligent decisions about fees and use fee estimation in a sophisticated way to include just enough fee for a transaction to be confirmed just as quickly as the owner or sender of that transaction wants it to be confirmed, with different levels of prioritization, for example, then you don't really have this problem. Because if of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of transactions, or the hundreds of thousands of transactions that happen per day, if the senders of these transactions use sophisticated fee estimation techniques in order for their transactions to get included, versus transactions that the owners really don't care too much about getting them included, perhaps because, as you say, they are spamming or stressing or attacking the network. We have to consider the issue of denial of service attacks, deliberate attacks. We have to consider the issue of attacks that are simply designed to stress the network, to improve the handling of fees, or to make a point in a debate. And also the possibility that there are applications that simply send a lot of transactions at low default fees. But if senders have wallets that are sophisticated enough to increase their fees by just 1 or 2 or 3 millibits, that solves the problem quite cleanly, because if thousands of different users increase their transactions by 1 or 2 millibits each, for each one of these users, it's not a big deal. But the cumulative effect of this is to skew the fee in such a way that someone who is trying to jam thousands of transactions into the network will actually have to consider the cost in fees, at which point, if those transactions are legitimate, they'll be willing to pay the fee, and if they're not, they won't. Ultimately, the determination of what is a legitimate and what is not a legitimate transaction should be made simply on the basis of, Is the sender willing to pay the necessary fee to have it confirmed? This is completely separate from the question of the total capacity of the network, because no matter what the total capacity of the network is, if you don't have a robust and intelligent fee system that is sophisticated enough to identify the capacity constraints, then bad actors will be able to crowd out transactions at low cost anytime, at any capacity. There is no capacity level at which a bad actor will not be able to jam the network at the expense of legitimate users, unless you have the possibility of creating an imbalance with fees, whereby each individual user with a legitimate transaction is just paying a small, slightly larger amount during a capacity crunch. But for someone who's attacking the network or trying to deny service by creating lots of transactions, we'll quickly see their cost escalating. The problem is when their cost doesn't escalate. If after an attacker has transmitted the first 100 transactions, the network fee has already started increasing, then the end result is that the attacker is making it more and more expensive for themselves to attack the network. And because they're trying to do it en masse, that cost is very high. Don't forget that the hash cash mechanism and the market-based mechanisms that we see used in Bitcoin were designed initially to be anti-spam mechanisms. There may be a time in the future where we see, and this has been proposed, a small end-user hash cash fee in transactions, which would force attackers to do a lot of computation. That's also a possibility. But it may be simply that Bitcoin represents hash cash in a way by proxy through the mining cost, and therefore the fee market in Bitcoin is sufficient to establish fair prioritization that is an effective anti-spam, anti-DDoS type without making centralized decisions about what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. Okay, and with that, we're going to wrap up. I don't see, let's see if there are any other questions. No new questions anywhere. Everybody's gone away for their Easter holiday or whatever other holiday. Things are pretty quiet today, but hopefully this answers many of your questions. Very good. Thank you all for attending today. This is the 6th session of the massive open online course for the Digital Currencies Master's degree at the University of Nicosia. I'm your host, Andreas Antonopoulos. I'll be answering your questions. Our next live session, which I'll be hosting, is on April 4th. Starts at 12 Eastern Daylight Time, 1700 or 5 p.m. British Standard Time, 1900 Eastern European Standard Time, or 7 p.m. We'll be talking about Ethereum, altcoins, and alternative ways of securing a blockchain. And in fact, some of the questions we discussed today, rather some of the questions you submitted today on side chains, alt chains, and Ethereum and other contracts and chains will be covered in our next session where the topic is more relevant. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your great questions. See you next week.